Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for logging on and joining us. I'm Seiji. I just graduated in mathematical and computational science from Stanford.
I'm David. I am a recent graduate of the master's program in statistics.
Hi, I'm Sandy, and I'm studying management science and engineering as a master's student.
And yeah, so we partnered with Stanford's RegLab out of the law school to monitor progression of CAFOs in satellite imagery. Before we start, just wanted to shout out all the people that made this work possible, from the NSF to Ben and DSSG, our amazing teaching team, and the Amazon Turk workers that made the labeled images possible, and environmental working group, all the environmental interest groups that went and did the legwork of picking out these CAFO locations. Now, just to trace through the skeleton of our presentation today, I'll start by explaining what a CAFO is. We'll go through kind of the background on that, talk about the data that we used to track the progression, and then more of our process and methodology in segmenting CAFOs out of imagery, tracking their progression, and then talking about the implications and future of this tool. So the problem statement. CAFOs are an acronym for concentrated animal feeding operations. Basically, the progression of modern agriculture has led to the specialization of animal feeding, and it takes a lot of manure, or it creates a lot of manure, and that excess seeps into waterways and is the #1 pollutant and causes algal blooms and destroys local ecosystems. So our goal is to create tools to help other agencies regulate CAFO growth. And in this particular aspect is the progression of CAFOs over time, their unpermitted expansion, illegal expansion. And so to do that, we use something called image segmentation, which is basically just picking the parts of an image out of the image. So it's pretty easy for humans to do. We can talk about the sky, the cat, the grass, the trees in the background, but it's a more complicated task for computers, right? But that helps us to identify whether the CAFO is there, and is more robust than other methods of segmentation. So for this, we used a neural net. And so our data started with 112 ground truth images labeled by the Amazon Mechanical Turk operators. And so as you can see, a CAFO is basically just a long rectangle in the image, and there are lagoons where the manure is stored. And so it was important to increase the size of our data set in order to have enough data to train on. So the 3 methods we used were data augmentation, creating our own semi-labeled data using Microsoft Building Footprint database, and transfer learning. Data augmentation is basically just taking the original labeled images that we were given and flipping them so the model had more to train on. And Microsoft Building Footprints, Microsoft did basically segmented imagery of the entire United States at one point using their own neural net. And so what we did, but they only gave out the segmentations, like the polygons that they found in their imagery, but not the imagery. And along with that, the segmentations weren't perfect and didn't always align with the images of the locations that we were looking at. So we use them as labeled data, even though they weren't perfect. So it's basically taking somebody else's segmentations and pretending it's ground truth, but it was really effective to train our model. And transfer learning is, oh, sorry.
So we also tried transfer learning to overcome the lack of labeled data. we first train our model from scratch on a different larger data set that's available for a similar task. And then since our model would have some prior knowledge from this pre-trained model, the learning process would be much faster and more accurate for our actual task. So the data set that we chose for this pre-training is from the OpenCity's AI challenge for building segmentation. And it's a massive data set of satellite images paired with their building masks, as you can see from the figure that we have on the slide. Here we have a nice flow chart showing where all of our data sets are being used. As I just mentioned, we pre-train our model on the OpenCity's AI data set. Then we train our model on our CAFO data, which consists of the Illinois satellite images provided by the RegLab, as well as the artificial ground truth data that we generated using Microsoft Building Footprints. Finally, for prediction, we feed in satellite images of Illinois CAFO locations at different points in time to generate their CAFO masks and eventually use them to detect changes over time. Here's a quick summary of all the data sets that we used. So we have the ground truth data provided by Amazon Turks. Then we have the additional images generated using Microsoft Building Footprints. And after data augmentation, we ended up using 8,448 images to train our model.
So moving on to the actual task of segmentation. The model that we use is something called the UNet. It gets its name from the obvious U shape you see here. It's sort of the canonical model used for image segmentation. The gist of it is that you take the original image, you downsample it to a much smaller image, and then you upsample it into a mask of the same size as the original image, but then you output the probabilities for each pixel being part of any class. So in this case, it's binary of being background or KFL. And then here are the results of our segmentation training. We did a standard 70-15-15 training validation test set. And then you see the results here. The pixel accuracy is very high, but then the IOU, the intersection over union, precision, recall, F score are not the highest you would want, because in most segmentation tasks, a good score would be around maybe 80s or high 80s. But then due to our data, because we know that there are a lot of samples that have missing segmentations and it might not align up perfectly with the satellite images because the Microsoft Building Footprints might have done the segmentation at a different time. So a lot of the assessment of our model had to be done qualitatively by actually looking at images. Here's a quick loss curve. You can see that it trains relatively quickly. It converges around 8 epochs. And then here are the outputs of our model. So you can see on the first image on the top left, the Microsoft segmentation did not see the middle two CAFOs, but then our model was able to come up with it. This might be why our metrics might not be the highest in the world. And then sort of the same pattern repeats across the images. And then looking through a lot of the outputs of our model, we were pretty happy with the results and they relatively matched up. So moving on to the task of CAFO progression. So the main goal is to detect if a CAFO location constructed any more buildings or if there's new CAFOs. The tricky part of doing this is that we don't have any explicit data that says, oh, this location had CAFO progression. So a lot of this involved trying to manually look through the images and seeing if there is any progression. And then here's an example. You can see on the image that there's 2 additional CAFOs on the right, whereas there weren't on the left. So a lot of this is a relatively unsupervised problem. So to tackle this, we came up with the idea of creating a null distribution of metrics that measure how different two outputs, two segmented masks are. And then the 4 metrics that we have are intersection over union, which we'll talk about, total predicted KFO pixel difference. So the total number of pixels that the model deemed KFOs, we take the difference of a mask taken in 2019 versus one in 2020. The difference of KFO clusters, we have an algorithm that sort of clustered the outputted KFO pixels and then found the difference between them, and then the minimum shifted pixel difference, which we will talk about. So we used 206 coordinates to build our null distribution. So our assumption for our null is that between satellite images that were taken a month apart, they should be pretty much the same. So using these metrics, we find out the noise in the satellite images, but then they should be relatively indicative that the images are the same. So quickly talking about intersection over union. So you can think of the two blue boxes as the KFOs. So you find the intersection on the image of the two KFO predicted classes. You divide it by the union. And then here is the minimum shifted pixel difference. So you have mask 1 and mask 2. Mask 1 is taken, say, July 2019, whereas mask 2 is taken July 2020. And then we shift the second mask up, down, left, right, 3 pixels. We only show the 3 up here for simplicity. And then we find the difference between the first mask and each of the shifted masks, the absolute difference. And then we find the element-wise minimum of each of the different different images, and we total them in order to compute how different they are. This is so that we are able to control for some of the noise in our model, whereas a KFO the model might be able to detect a KFO, but it's a couple of pixels away, or it's like close, but not exactly the same. Just sort of tries to account for that. And then we can see the metrics for each of the images here, and then the percentile in our null distribution. The tricky part of evaluating this sort of pipeline is that the only way to check it is to check it manually, go through a lot of the images where we know that there's progression and seeing how the metrics hold up. And then for the most part, we don't get perfect, say 5% significance or something of that sort, but then they're generally on the right side of the distribution. So for intersection over union, we'd want, if 2 images are very different, we expect them to be on the lower end of the distribution, whereas for the other 3, the higher the number indicates the more different they are. And then we found that IOU and shift difference works the best, whereas the other 2 were a little bit too noisy to use. And you can see, I'm gonna see if I can get a pointer working. I don't know if you can see the mouse, but on the first image, you can see clear progression. Oh, clear progression on the top left part of the KFOs. And then our model in the segmented mask is able to pick it up, and our IOU is around 22 percentile, whereas shift difference is 89. And then the same sort of pattern repeats with the next 2 images. They're on the right side. And then the 4th image, the 2, they're relatively same images. So we wanted to see if it still lies relatively in the middle of the distribution. And then for intersection over union and shift difference, it does at 66 percentile and 40 percentile. So it fits with our general trend that we wanted to see.
To conclude, our resulting model isn't perfect, but it can be a useful tool in the detection pipeline. And we're also hoping that it'll be useful in many other applications where building expansion over time is unpermitted or non-compliant. And some things that we might try in the future to improve our results are using higher resolution images to be trained in our model, and coming up with better combination of metrics for measuring change detection over time, and also using more data for null distribution And finally, increasing the size of our unit model to match what was originally published in the paper. That's it for our presentation, and I'll now open the floor for any questions or thoughts.